Good evening and welcome to the Woven Out podcast. Today we are joined by the great Dr. Andrew Bernstein, a philosopher, author, and a passionate defender of reason, freedom, and capitalism. He has taught at top universities, lectured around the world, and written powerful books like The Capitalist Manifesto, Capitalism Unbound, which I have a translated copy here in Hebrew. Please make sure you buy it and support his amazing work. And tonight, Dr. Bernstein is going to make the case for Western civilization. So kindly allow me to ask first, how are you today? And of course, welcome.
I'm doing well, Harry. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. So let's begin with first defining what is Western civilization, and is it a matter of race or geography, or do you define it by its values? And if so, what are those values?
That's a very good question. Typically, the even the very name indicates geography, right? Western, meaning the western part of Europe, France, Britain, and of course many of their colonies, the former colonies, North America and Australia, and so on. The one thing we could say before we get to the really fundamentals is it's the culture. If we're gonna focus on geography, which we shouldn't, but we should at least mention it. The culture that originates in classical Greece, especially in Athens, when the great philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the great writers, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and so on. The culture that originates in classical Greece, and not just in literature and philosophy, but in many other fields. But and has been dominant in Western countries, Western Europe, North America, and so on. But that's secondary. The key point here is the commitment to reason. Now, a couple of points on this. Certainly, the commitment to reason is Greek in its origin. The great Greek thinkers. Certainly, Western culture has not been consistent. Sadly, has not been consistent in its devotion to reason. It's been religion has been one major element. One of my essays, Aristotle versus Religion, shows how the conflict within Judaism, certainly within Christianity, and above all within Islam. The faith-based philosophy, religion is one, it has been opposed to the rational element, and it's not just religion. In the 20th century, post-Kantian, post-Hegelian philosophies such as National Socialism, which is overtly opposed to reason and embraces emotionalism, and communism, which is materialistic and rejects the mind. There are these different philosophies that have opposed reason. So the West has not been consistently devoted to reason, but I think more than any other culture around the world that I know of, the Western civilization has the strongest commitment to reason and consequently to the rights of an individual to his or her own mind. And the essence of Western civilization, at its best, is the commitment to reason that I think exceeds that of any other culture around the world.
I understand. I would like to ask, how would you define reason, and in what way it's different from acting on faith or emotion, and why it's so why it's so important? Why it produce such huge differences?
Right. Also, a very good question. I think the great Greek philosopher Aristotle was the first great exponent of reason. Two things about Aristotle. I mean, he made many errors in physics. We know that, which is understandable, in the 4th century BC. But his Aristotle's devotion to observation, what in philosophy is known as an empirical approach. The realization all knowledge originates in sense experience. All knowledge originates in observation. And then, let's not forget, Aristotle is the founder of the field of logic. He initiated the field almost from scratch. And the greatest thing he did is that he recognized that knowledge is gained by logical, non-contradictory thinking about observed facts. Knowledge is gained by means of logical, non-contradictory thinking about observed facts. And I think we could say Aristotle, more than any other single individual, taught humanity how to think. That's his greatest accomplishment. That's what reason is. It's logical, non-contradictory thinking ultimately about observed facts. And consequently, that is the way we gain knowledge of the world. Faith doesn't... let's put it this way, Harry, excuse me.
Yes.
Reason starts with observation of facts, observation of nature. Faith starts with a book, whether it's the Old Testament for the Jews, Old and New Testament for the Christians, the Quran, the Muslims, excuse me, the Upanishads, for the Hindus. But you start with a book, which you believe was written by men divinely inspired. And then you take whatever the book says, you believe it. That burning bushes speak, men live inside whales, or virgins give birth, or whatever it is. And you take it. Maybe you could, depends how religious the society is, maybe you could criticize it and question it. But in the end, you're supposed to believe it. And if the society is really religious, you may not even be able to criticize it without having your head chopped off or being burned at the stake. So faith is very, not only very different from reason, but it's opposed to it. Opposed, because reason will tell you burning bushes don't speak, and virgins don't give birth. Reason. So they've often been in conflict. And emotionalism is the idea that I just go by my feelings. Whatever I feel is true for me. So, I mean, on that approach, you can believe anything. And again, I mentioned the Nazis before, National Socialism. They believe that moral character is in the blood, and it's inherited, biologically. Now, all of biological science says no. That's moral character is not based on blood, not based on your biology. Moral character is based on the choices that individuals make. So the Nazis just pushed aside whole field of biology, in effect, because they went with their feelings. And they said in so many words, how do we know all this? It's in our blood and that's a great quote, isn't it? From very evil people, but it's in our blood and our bowels. We just feel it in our guts, And on an emotionalist premise, you could believe anything. And notice faith is a type of emotionalism. As Ayn Rand points out, there is no, supernatural realm. So where do the religious people get their faith-based beliefs from? Ultimately, they feel it. I feel that there is a God, and I feel that God tells us to do such and such. And then religion, in terms of its method, reduces to emotionalism or subjectivism. It's a matter of we feel it. It doesn't matter. Only one last point here, Harry. Logic tells us you can't create something from nothing. You couldn't create even a tiny little pin or a matchstick from nothing. You want to make a pin.
Yeah.
If you want to make a pin, you need some tin or something. But to create the vastness of the cosmos from nothing, logically impossible. Logically impossible. But on faith, you just dismiss logic and you feel it.
So in your opinion, Western civilization is like an antidote to the corruption of our understanding of reality, or our detachment from reality, which will eventually lead to wrong epistemology, which will eventually lead to the wrong ethics and politics. Can you speak to that, please?
Yeah, Western civilization at its best.
Yes.
When the when the Catholic Church was burning people at the stake.
Not
You know,
so
during,
much, yeah.
yeah, that's not and it's not just, I don't want to blame just the church, but that's what religious fundamentalists do. The Orthodox, they have the orthodoxy, they have these core beliefs, and if you don't believe, and when they have power, whether they're Jews or Muslims or Christians, when they have power, they will execute. The Jews used to stone, the ancient Jews stoned you to death. The church burned you at the stake. So did the Protestants. Muslims chop off your head. They'll when they have power, they will execute you. But Western civilization at its best is a commitment to reason, which means, and you can see how and why the logic here. James Madison, who the prime author of the U.S. Constitution and virtual sole author of the Bill of Rights, why he wrote freedom of speech right into the First Amendment. It's a respect for reason. Freedom of speech means freedom of the mind. When you respect the mind and recognize reason is the means by which we gain knowledge, then you recognize individual, the reasoning capacity is a property of individual human beings. And we need to respect their right to think as they will, to speak as they will, to argue if necessary, debate, present evidence. And I think, to me, freedom of speech is a key issue because it's freedom of the mind. And I believe only people who are either violent, either exercise violence or advocate violence, they're the only ones I think who I think we have the right to shut them up. Everybody else has the right to speak out, to speak their mind on what they think, and this is the one way by which we gain truth. Western civilization at its best, because of its commitment to reason, has been much more committed to freedom. And freedom is fundamentally freedom of the mind, the recognizing your right to think as you will, as long as you're not a criminal, as long as you're not initiating force or fraud against innocent people. Your right to think as you will, to live your life as you will, to speak out, to argue, to debate, to create new products, to create new technologies, to start companies, to go into business, to make money, and so on and so forth. Western civilization at its best is a commitment to reason and freedom and the principle of individual rights. Not an accident that John Locke, the English philosopher who is so important in developing the theory of individual rights, that he was an empiricist, that he believed all knowledge originates in sense experience, meaning every man and every woman have the capacity to gain knowledge, because we all have the capacity to observe. And so the fruits of this, of Western commitment to reason and freedom, you see the advances in philosophy, the great works of art, in literature, the Western writers from Homer through Shakespeare and hundreds of great writers, and I would include Ayn Rand in that, in painting and music and in all of the arts, in theoretical science, people like Galileo and Newton, Einstein, in applied science and technology. Thomas Edison is a good example. You've seen this outpouring of genius in every field, from A to Z, from architecture to zoology and every field in between. When freedom flourishes, when freedom is protected, the mind flourishes, and you see creativity in every field, including, let's not forget, agricultural science, Harry, because historically, so many people have died of famine, and still do in North Korea or various totalitarian states. The developments in agricultural science that we could feed 8 billion human beings is a product of respect for the rational mind and the freedom of the rational mind to make these kinds of advances in science. So this is Western civilization at its best.
Mhm. How does Western individualism differ from tribalism and collectivism seen in other systems, and what are the dangers of those other systems? How can you demonstrate, especially to my audience who have this collectivist state of mind sometimes, how do you demonstrate the dangers? And yeah.
Well, individualism is the moral theory that an individual's life belongs to the individual. So your life belongs to you, Harry. My life belongs to me, and so on. Mary's, this is true for any race, and, universally applied. This is true for members of any race or either gender. Mary's life belongs to Mary. Doesn't belong to the state. Doesn't belong to the church. Your life belongs to you. Well, it follows logically then that if your life belongs to you, then your mind belongs to you, and you have the right to use your mind to further your life, to think, to get an education, to develop your mind. And this is the theory of individual rights, that the individual has an inalienable. Thomas Jefferson, who unfortunately was a slave owner, and we condemn him for that, legitimately so. But I'm not throwing out the baby with the bath, as they say.
Mhm.
I'm not going to overlook all the great things that he did in his life and career because he was a slave owner. The Declaration of Independence, he wrote beautifully that an individual has the inalienable a right to life, liberty, and property, and that's very well put. Consequently, when you and Jefferson could have written, because it follows logically, you have the individual has the inalienable right to life, liberty, uh, your own thinking, your own mind, and pursuit of happiness. Um, so, individualism is the moral code of individual rights, which liberates the best members of the human race. The human race, those who choose to use their minds, those who choose to educate themselves and think critically. And these are the people who make progress in every field, like I said, from agriculture to zoology or anything in between. Now, collectivism and tribalism is one form of collectivism. Collective just means group. So it's groupism, whether it's the tribe or the nation or the state or the race or the working class and the communist, in the Marxist communist version. Uh, the group is preeminent over has authority over the individual. The individual is subordinate to the group, and you have to obey the group. You can see how this leads inevitably to dictatorship in some form. The state, the society as a whole, including its government, is supreme, and the individual must obey. You must obey the state. And it's often been pointed out, Harry, that the German philosopher Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who's enormously influential in his politics, his Hegel's writings are very difficult to read, to put it mildly. But his book on political philosophy, philosophy of right, is much easier to read than his works on deeper philosophy. And he says in so many words, I don't remember the exact quote, but he says your life belongs to the state, and if the state decides to take your life, you have to submit. The states will be done. In
I
other
think
words,
he used the idea of flowers, maybe, if some flowers have to be destroyed in order
I,
for the state to flourish. Yeah, I mean, the state is God, right? So everything is possible.
yes, yes, he's known as a state worshiper in the history of political philosophy because he thinks the state is divine in some sense, and therefore it's will be done. Like you said, and unfortunately, his philosophy became very popular in Germany, and he died 1830 something.
Mhm.
Um, his his philosophy became very popular, and through Marx, who was a devout student of Hegel. Communism developed, and National Socialism, or Nazism, both developed out of Hegel's philosophy that the group is supreme, the individual serves. Now, for the Nazis, the group was the race; they're fighting race war. For the communists, the group was the class; they're fighting class war. But either way, the collective is supreme. The individual must sacrifice for the collective. Your life belongs to the state. And if the state decides it's going to sacrifice your life, well, they have the moral authority to do so. And we know the communists and the Nazis sacrificed millions of innocent human beings, millions.
So in order for Hegel to sacrifice our lives to the state, he actually needed to base his writings on what Kant did before that, with what to destroy our ability to know reality. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Oh, Hegel's definitely a Kantian. Let me see if I remember. I should remember the dates. He had Kant was 1724 to 1804. Hegel, again, I'm drawing a blank. 1770 to 1831.
Yes.
So Hegel admired Kant. Kant was very popular. Germany is known as the land of poets and philosophers, and Kant and Hegel were both university professors, both popular. And Kant's ethics here, his epistemology, his theory of how we gain knowledge, is certainly important. But his ethics, the theory of right and wrong, his ethics is the direct conduit or direct connector to Hegel, because Kant wiped out any form of self-interest from a proper ethics. Any proper ethics to Kant has to be self-denying and self-sacrificing. And the one criticism of Kant has always been that he had very little of original thought to say about politics, which is true. He didn't. But Hegel did. Hegel is like the political wing of the Kantian philosophy, because we have to sacrifice ourselves in order to be good, says Kant. Well, sacrifice ourselves to whom? Now, he was a devout Puritan, but he's also an 18th century Enlightenment thinker. So he doesn't say to God, nor does he say to the state. We just have to obey the moral law and deny ourselves and sacrifice ourselves. Well, Hegel answered the question. Sacrifice ourselves to whom or to what? Yeah, the state. Yeah, the state. Hegel is a very influential political philosopher, applying Kant's ethics into politics. Self-sacrifice is virtue, and self-sacrifice, that's Kant, and self-sacrifice to the state, that's Hegel. Then Marx, by the way, comes along, another German philosopher. And Marx comes along, and he's a materialist. Kant and Hegel are Christians. Marx is a materialist and an atheist, meaning, materialist meaning everything is matter. Mm-hmm. There's nothing but matter. And so if everything's matter, then there's no afterlife, there's no God, there's no salvation, there's none of that. It's just life on earth. And we need stuff. We need food. We need housing. We need medical care. We need clothing. We need material stuff. And so, what Marx adds is sacrifice to the state in distinctively material form, that we have to give up some part of our income, so that the poorest members of society have enough housing, have enough food, and we have to sacrifice to the state in that way. So there's, I think of Kant, Hegel, and Marx as the unholy triumvirate, the unholy trio, the German philosophers who have done so much harm to human life.
They are the great destroyers. I think Ayn Rand is speaking about Kant as the great destroyer.
Actually, you know who coined that term about Kant? You're right. It was the Jewish philosopher Moses Mendelson.
Oh, he did. Okay.
Yeah, Mendelson, one of the, this 18th century, the Jews, for the most part, were still locked away in the ghettos at night. And the Jewish mind, all the genius in the Jewish people was mostly studying, the Talmud, was studying religion. Mendelson was one of the first to venture out of the ghetto, to try and assert his rights to get a secular education. And in fairness, as we know, one of many tragedies about the Nazis is, and I mean, it's an atrocity what they've done, but the tragedy is that German culture prior to that was the best place on the continent for Jews. The Jews were terribly persecuted in Russia and Ukraine, Poland, the pogroms of Eastern Europe. Whereas Moses Mendelson, one of the first Jews to venture out of the ghetto, seek a secular education, and to their credit, there were some German Christians who supported that the Jews have rights, and so you start to see more Jews venture out of the ghetto, get an education not just in religion but in philosophy, and physics, and biology, and literature, and you start to see this full flowering of Jewish geniuses. And Mendelson, 18th century, was a contemporary of Kant, and he called Kant the All Destroyer. That was Moses. Moses Mendelson, by the way, was a grandfather of Felix Mendelson, the great composer. But yeah, it was Moses Mendelson who coined that term about Kant, the All Destroyer.
Mhm. I would like to ask, there is like some ongoing debate, especially when you hear Christians. They are saying that basically the Judeo-Christian is what allowed the conditions for the flowering of the West.
Mhm.
And I know that, and you and other objectivists, of course, are speaking about the America as a product of the Enlightenment.
Right.
And earlier you spoke about Kant and Hegel and all the other German philosophers who are basically anti-enlightenment. And my question is, who put the seeds for the development of the Western civilization as you see it, being consistent and healthy and good for life? Is it something? I mean, how sorry, it's like, how do you settle the matter that America wasn't based on Christianity or Judeo-Christian value, but Enlightenment ones? Because what's the source of this Western civilization? I'm sorry for my confused question.
No, I get it, and it's a very good question. And as a philosopher, the question I often raise to the historians, question that they should raise, but too often do not, is why here and why now? Why in the 18th century and why in Britain's North American colonies? If Christianity is responsible, why not in the 8th century when Christianity was much more influential and powerful than it was in the 18th? By the 18th century Enlightenment, it was under attack. Christianity was on the defensive. It was still very powerful, but it was all powerful in the 8th century. If Christianity is responsible, for freedom and individual rights, we should expect to see it at the height of its power, developing these ideas. But it didn't. When it was at the height of its power, faith-based beliefs were dominant, and they burned at the stake anybody who disagreed. There's no freedom possible when religion is a dominant cultural force. When it's a dominant cultural force, faith rules supreme, and anybody who challenges it is in big trouble. Now it's the Enlightenment, and here John Locke is the English philosopher, 1632 to 1704. So he's 17th century, just lives into the very beginning of the 18th century. But two treatises of civil government published late 1680s. And the idea of individual rights is just starting to blossom in England and in Great Britain and England and Scotland. Locke is a major contributor to that, but Locke is mixed. He's a practicing Christian, probably an Anglican. I don't remember, but he's practicing one Protestant denomination. To be anybody in England back then, you needed to be an Anglican, Church of England. But but he's also an Aristotelian. He's a mixture, of Christianity and Greek and Greek philosophy. But it's not an accident that we see Britain becoming much freer in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, and that Britain's colonies across the Atlantic are also reading Locke's writings and becoming much more committed to individual rights and freedom. This is the Enlightenment project. This is the Enlightenment agenda in action. Use of reason in practical matters to improve the terrible poverty that almost everybody lived in, and then since reason is the way to do it, to recognize and reason based on observation. Locke also, like Aristotle, an empiricist, reasons based on observation, that therefore every man and every woman can observe and gain knowledge, and you liberate the mind of every man and every woman, and you see the commoners, not the aristocrats here, but the commoners now freed to make great advances. James Watt, perfects the steam engine, goes into production with Matthew Boulton, and the human production of consumer goods is becoming mechanized. In the United States, well, in Britain's North American colonies, there were no aristocrats, and you see all these commoners. Benjamin Franklin, I think, is the best example, but Jefferson, Washington, Madison. You see the commitment, the Enlightenment commitment to reason, which leads to the commitment to freedom. I'll say this about Christianity, because I think all my Jewish friends are going to be horrified. But I think, to me, Christianity is the least bad of the major religions, even though it's done terrible things, especially to the Jews. No doubt about that. But I think Christianity is the least bad because they stress Christians generally, there's always exceptions, but they generally stress the personal soul, that you and I have a soul that's distinctively our own. It's not some, tribal kind of thing. My soul is mine and your soul is yours. And the personal soul that God loves and God treasures is an individualistic element in us. And this is where the Christians are so much better than the Nazis or communists, because the Nazis and communists, completely tribal, completely collective, try and wipe out every element of individuality. The Christians glorify. Now, this glorification of the individual soul is that has historically been in conflict with the call for faith-based belief, obedience to the church, and so on. But it kind of limits that God wants me to go by my own conscience. This is logical on Christian belief. God wants me to go by my own conscience, and if necessary, stand up to the church, the king, the state. Sir Thomas More is a good example. Stand up, speak truth to power. That the glorification of the personal soul, I think, is not an accident. Let's put it this way. That freedom develops in the Christian countries, let's say, rather than the Islamic ones, or Hindu or Buddhist. Because I think Christianity is the as bad as it is, and I'm not going to defend it. I'm just going to say its commitment to the individual soul, to the personal soul, is an individualistic element in it that I think makes it better than the other religions, or less bad than the other religions, and I think contributed to the rise of the principle of individual rights. But mostly it's an Enlightenment phenomenon. It's the Greek approach, the commitment to reason, rather than the Judeo-Christian approach and the commitment to faith, that leads to this outpouring. There's all these advances in science and the arts and everything, and to political freedom. Again, if you're committed to reason, then you have to respect the mind of every man and every woman to reason, and it's very logical, and that's the Enlightenment approach.
Mhm. Christianity seems very peaceful until you take very seriously the prophecies in Revelation, because on the second coming of Christ, many people are going, to eternal hell, and that's not very nice.
Yeah, and Christianity's history is bloody too. Maybe not as bloody as Islam's history, but that's damning it with faint praise. Islam has been an enormously aggressive religion, and it still is.
Yes, actually, I don't understand. Maybe you can help me understand it. Why is it that the focus is always on the Western world, putting all the blemish on slavery and colonialism and all the rest of it, and they don't see what Islam is responsible for? Islam actually reached the borders of Iceland and Denmark. They are responsible for slavery of about 3 million white Europeans and about 50 million or more of slaves in the worst possible conditions. And they were very imperialistic, like the Umayyad and the Abbasid empires. So why is it that the world is completely ignoring what Islam was doing and putting all the attack on Western civilization and its institutions?
It's a very good question. Here's my essay, "The Case for Western Civilization and the Objective Standard," this is the fall 2024 issue. This, for any of your viewers, Harry, this essay, we'll discuss it right now, but this essay goes in depth on that question, and they could find it at the website of what is it, theobjectivestandard.com, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, yeah, those criticisms that you're mentioning, overwhelmingly, they come from Marxists.
Yes.
And Marxism divides the world up into the oppressor and the oppressed, right? Mm-hmm. And originally, it was in the hands of Marx and Engels themselves. It was the owning class oppresses the working class. But then, we've seen through the postmodernists more recently that it's the idea that oppression is much broader than economic. The males oppress the females, and the whites oppress the non-whites, and the West oppresses the non-Western countries, and so on. So looking at it through and also part of this is it's an article of faith to Marxism that if an individual or a company or a nation is successful, the only way you get successful is by exploiting the poor, or oppressing the women or the non-whites or the third world or whatever. In our day, the West is successful. I mean, why do the Marxists hate Israel and they glorify Hamas? One main reason for that is Israel is successful, and Hamas and the Palestinian population, for the most part, are miserable and abysmally poor. So they just make up these myths. I mean, they even talk about genocide. Israelis are committing genocide in Gaza. Now, I've read from U.S. military commanders who have combat experience in various wars, real experienced U.S. commanders, that there's never been a military in the history of the world that tries to avoid civilian casualties as much as the IDF, and I suspect that's true. But the Marxists, Israelis are committing genocide, which means deliberately trying to wipe out the Palestinian population. So they're lying. But they're look. Marxism to me is a philosophy. Here's how I describe it: is a philosophy of wannabe. How did I put it nicely?
It's bitterness and hatred and jealousy
and envy. Yeah. Marxism is a philosophy of for and by psychopathological wannabe mass murderers. They want to destroy the successful people.
Yes.
They want to destroy. So anybody who's successful is a target. Western civilization in our day is successful. Israel versus its enemies, is that in the microcosm. But the West versus the non-West. The West is very successful, and non-Western nations, for the most part, are not. Certainly not to the same degree. So the West has to be evil, has to be exploitative. And hence you get all these attacks on the West. And you're right. Yeah, they overlook. What about the Mongols? They're non-Western, and they slaughtered millions and millions and millions of people. Nobody mentions the Mongols.
Yeah.
Or the Muslim, the Arabic Muslims. Slavery, vastly more so than out of Africa. Many more slaves taken out of Africa by the Arabs than by the Europeans. And
Not to mention, if I may, that black people actually took the black people from the mainland in Africa, and then they sold them to the Arabian traders.
Yeah.
So, and if you think about it, if I'm not mistaken, to the transatlantic, to the US, they brought about 400,000 black slaves. But in this area of the Middle East, we are talking about many millions of slaves who were also castrated. How do you say it?
Castrated, right?
Castrated, yeah. And
right.
Nobody speaks about it. Brazil, 4 million slaves, and nobody speaks about that. And the Caribbeans, just the white Americans.
Yes. That's exactly right. And the transatlantic crossing was brutal, and something like 10% of the slaves died in the crossing. But the Trans-Sahara crossing was vastly worse. And what I've read, like 80% of the slaves died, from dehydration crossing the Sahara. And you're right, the millions and millions and millions of black slaves in the Arab Middle East, but there's very little black population there. Well, why? Well, you answered it, Harry, because the Muslims castrated, the male slaves. So the Arabic slave trade and slavery this is one issue, good issue. Slavery has existed all over the world, going back forever, all over the world. Like you said, powerful tribes in Africa conquered and enslaved, the weaker tribes and so on, whether for their own slaves or to sell them to Arabic or later on to European slave traders. Slavery is ubiquitous, meaning it's everywhere. Abolitionism is Western. There were people historically who opposed slavery, the Roman Stoics, for example, but there was no concerted abolitionist movement until late 18th century Britain. Again, I raised the question, why here and why now? Why 18th century Great Britain? Well, it's the Enlightenment, the home of John Locke, the principle of individual rights, and the idea that your life belongs to you, not to the king, also includes that your life belongs to you, not to the slave traders. And so you see the British, the first country in history to abolish slavery in the 19th century, the French shortly thereafter in the 1830s, the Americans in 1865, and so on. So slavery was everywhere. Abolitionism is Western. That's completely overlooked, and slavery still exists. As you and I speak, Harry, 10% of the entire population of North Korea, 10% of the whole country is at heavy slave labor, brutal slave labor, including women and little kids. And of course, black slaves in Sudan by the thousands, because Islam prohibits the enslavement of other Muslims, but everybody else is fair game. And so they have the black slaves, many of them are Christians, so anyway, Islam, and of course the endless jihadist attacks that in Israel and any number of other places around the world. They hate, the Marxist intellectuals hate Western civilization, and it's even worse than Marxism. It's even worse than wanting to establish communism, which is bad enough. But it's nihilism. The nihilism, this desire to destroy, to tear down, to kill, Western civilization successful, we're going to tear it down. Israel successful, we're going to burn it to the ground. From the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. And what happens to all the Israeli accomplishments? The Israeli Jews and the Israeli Arabs, what happens to they just get killed. They tear it down. It's killing and destroying for its own sake.
The level of insanity is mind-blowing. For example, the idea of queer for Palestine. I would like to see a queer in Gaza surviving for more than a minute.
Yeah, well, they take the gay guys up to the rooftops and push them off, right?
That if they have rooftops, I think we help them with that.
Well, they'll chop off their heads in that case.
Yeah. Again, about the movement of abolishing slavery, many say that it was actually a Christian endeavor. Can you speak about that? Because I think it's not correct historically.
Well, again, the one really good method of arriving at the truth on these complicated issues is raise the question, why here and why now? Now, it's true that a lot of Christians, Quakers in particular, who were abolitionists. It's true that a lot of Bishop Wilberforce in England was he was a bishop, probably the Anglican Church. I don't remember, but he was a Protestant clergyman, was instrumental in pushing for the abolition of the slave trade and then for slavery. So Christians certainly played a big role in this. But again, when you raise the question, why here and why now, why England and why the 18th century, when it's the Enlightenment culture, Christianity is already being weakened by the rational philosophies of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Why Christianity when it's in its weaker version? Why not Christianity 1,000 years before that when it was much stronger? And it was the Enlightenment thinkers who, some of them were religious. Locke was a practicing Christian. But Voltaire in France and who was I don't even remember if Voltaire believed in God or didn't. He certainly was antagonistic to the Catholic Church. Might have been a deist. I'm not sure. But the Enlightenment thinkers, the commitment to reason again is what led to the commitment to individual rights. That you have to respect the rights of a reasoning being to guide his life by his own mind. That's what led to the commitment to freedom, which include not just the rise of political freedom against the monarchy and the aristocracy, but abolitionism against slavery. And in my book, The Capitalist Manifesto, I had a quote in the I think it's probably in the chapter on slavery, because I published that 20 years ago. I can't remember it offhand, but there was from one of the historians who said that Bishop Wilberforce, the main political, he was a Christian clergyman, main political driver of an abolitionist movement, a political movement to abolish slavery in Britain, turn of the 19th century. Bishop Wilberforce was well aware of Enlightenment thinking on this issue. That was the quote. He was well aware of Enlightenment thinking on this issue. So give credit to the Christians in this regard, at least some of them. They adopted the Enlightenment philosophy of individual rights. It did coincide with the Christian commitment to the personal soul, and a lot of Christians did, especially the Quakers, did spearhead, or help push the abolitionist movement. But it has its origins in Enlightenment thinking, commitment to reason, and the commitment to individual rights.
I see. It seems like we spoke about it a little bit. There is a growing trend to attack Western culture in schools and the media. I would like to ask, in your opinion, what's behind this, and what are the consequences of that if we don't stop it, and what can be done to stop it?
Well, it's very harmful. I mean, again, it comes from the political left. It comes from Marxists, the same people we were talking about before. The desire to destroy at the surface, it's a Marxist desire to destroy capitalism, and establish a socialist state or even a communist totalitarian state. And the smoking gun here that gives it away, that this is the drive towards totalitarianism, is the animosity towards freedom of speech, the leftist desire to wipe out the First Amendment in the United States. Some examples. What was his name? Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, Democrat. About 8, 9, 10 years ago, was advocating that we need to criminalize denial of dangerous man-made warming. We need to criminalize it. If anybody openly rejects the theory that human beings are responsible for dangerous warming, we'll put them in prison, for that. And there were others who said the same thing. And Biden established a disinformation governance board at the Department of Homeland Security. John Kerry said not long ago that the First Amendment stands in the way of preventing people from holding wrong ideas. They want to wipe out freedom of speech. They just want anybody who challenges leftist orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. We're going to criminalize it. We'll lock you up for it. So that is totalitarianism, and that's the political goal here, to establish, I think, a communist state. And a lot of the critics, the conservative critics, and I think they're right on this, but they talk about establishing an elitist society. And this goes back to Plato, right? The philosopher king, that society should be ruled by the most educated, the most intelligent, and the most educated. Most of us are fools. We don't have enough sense to run our own lives. And my life will be better if it's run by Hillary Clinton rather than by me. That's the elitist view that they've held. Statist intellectuals have held, going all the way back to Plato, and they get frustrated with us. What Hillary Clinton called us a bunch of deplorables, and Joe Biden said we're garbage people. The leftist mentality.
Relentless.
Yeah. The leftist mentality is towards people like me is, why don't you see everybody's life will be better if you just give us the power? We're the wise, the educated, the elite. We'll run society better than letting people run their own lives. Don't you see? We'll have a planned economy and everything will be better. And my attitude is, can I curse on your show, Harry?
Of course.
My attitude is, go fuck yourself. I don't want my life run by you, and I don't want my daughter's life run by you. But that's the real conflict in politics, is the idea that the idea that individuals have a mind and we could govern our own lives better than the state could govern our lives, versus the idea that no, the educated intellectual elite should control the state, have complete power, and they will rule our lives better. They will govern our lives better than we can govern our lives. There's the real clash in political philosophy. And the people you're talking about want to destroy individual rights, the leftists, and establish this kind of communist totalitarian state where they run the state, they have complete power, and everything, the whole society, not just the economy, will be planned by the specialists, by the trained psychologists, sociologists, and economists, and everything will be a lot better.
Nowadays, it seems like they are moving towards some kind of technocracy with the AI and everything. I'm really worried about that, because it's the same people. Only now they have the technology in their hands, and they can basically condition and control all aspects of our society.
In the hands of communists, it's or Nazis, anybody who's a statist. Statism meaning the state should have total power and the individual must obey. That kind of technology in the hands of statists is very dangerous.
Yes. What is it about Western civilization as the product of the good Enlightenment, not Kant, Rousseau, Hegel, and the rest of them? What is it that makes the Western civilization so open for attacks? It seems like the ideas themselves that support Western civilization makes Western civilization vulnerable to these endless attacks.
Um, well, one thing that comes to my mind, in answer to your question, is freedom of the mind and freedom of speech, which is its corollary, includes the freedom of evil people to speak.
Yes.
You know, uh, so the leftists that I'm talking about who want to push the United States or Israel or the Western world generally into communism, they have the right to speak up. They don't have the right to initiate force, but they have the right to speak up. And unfortunately, they control the school system, and they've indoctrinated thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of kids, with their basically Marxist ideology. Here's one of my books, Harry, my book on education. Why
Mhm.
Johnny still can't read or write or understand math, and what we could do about it. They've they've severely damaged the school system in the United States. Severely, a lot of the kids, my college students, struggle just to read, uh, and they've replaced reading, writing, arithmetic with leftist propaganda.
Political
Socialism.
activism,
Yeah,
basically.
exactly.
Mhm.
Socialism is better than capitalism. Man-made warming's destroying the planet. White people are evil. We can all choose our gender, including little kids. They've replaced real education with a lot of political propaganda. Now, unfortunately, these bastards have the right to speak, and in a private school, they have the right to. I don't, uh, public schools, government schools make it complicated, but in private schools, they have the right to preach to students like this. They have a right to speak. So they have a right to attack Western civilization intellectually. What that means, though, is freedom of the mind and freedom of speech means we have the right to refute them and show them how show innocent people how wrong they are. And by the way, look who's calling for suppression of free speech. It's not the advocates of capitalism. It's the advocates of socialism and communism. So it shows they're scared.
Mhm.
They believe, they recognize, the bad guys do, that if the good guys have the right to speak out, the good guys have the better arguments. And so the leftists know, on a free market of ideas, they
They
can't
have no
win
chance.
the
Yeah.
intellectual battle. So they have to suppress their enemies, and that's why they oppose freedom of speech, and they always do, whether it's the Nazis, the communists, the Muslims, the Christians during the Dark Ages. They'll when they know their ideas will lose in a free market of ideas in open and honest debate, then they'll stifle freedom of speech, and even they'll put you in prison or even kill you
Mhm.
for disagreeing with them.
Do you think that all those collectivist movements like Marxism and fascism and all the rest of that are basically like a secular messianic version of Christianity? Like
Yeah.
as, as if they transformed into something which is, instead of God, putting the state as the head of this new pyramid?
Yes. Yeah. I wouldn't. I guess definitely religion. I guess we would have to point the finger at Christianity here, because Christianity was the dominant, still is, the dominant religion in the West. Uh, but definitely, it's a secular form of religion. The state replaces God. Uh, the code of self-sacrifice remains in effect. Now we have to serve the state, not serve God. You can't challenge the secular God.
Yeah,
Because
dogmatic and superstitious and ritualistic, all the hallmarks
Mhm.
of the same
Yeah,
behavior.
it's a secular version of religion. Yeah, it is. It is. And the scariest part, of course, is the animosity towards the mind, towards freedom of thought, and they will kill you for for speaking. It was not an accident. Ayn Rand, who grew up under the communists, escaped from the Soviet Union. What year was that? 1926. So when she was 21. And not an accident that she wrote her great novels, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and developed her philosophy of objectivism in the United States, not in the Soviet Union. If she tried to publish those novels, she might have been able to write them locked away in her attic somewhere by candlelight. You're right, and hiding the manuscript under her mattress. She might have been able to write them and maybe have a few friends, trusted friends, read them. But if she had tried to publish them, they would have sent her to a Siberian gulag, and she would have been dead probably in a matter of months. So it's the suppression of the mind is what's always so evil, whether it's religious or secular, whether it's the Jews, the Christians, the Muslims, the Nazis, the communists, whoever it is. It's when you recognize, when you protect freedom of the mind, civilization flourishes. When you suppress the mind, you get dark ages and totalitarian states. It's that's the key principle.
So basically, the summary of what you're teaching us is that Western civilization allowed the man to take control of his life, to liberate his mind, to use reason, to connect himself to actual reality and not some imaginary dialectic nonsense. And eventually, the standard of life is one's life, right?
Yes.
Sorry, how to say, objective morality is based on the idea that life itself is the standard by which we should judge and pursue our own goals and values. Correct?
That's right. Yes, that is correct. And the what Western civilization did more than any other culture that that I've ever known, and I'll say this over and over again, is it liberated the human mind. It recognized, one, the power of reason to understand nature and nature's laws and improve human life on Earth, and two, that reason is an individualistic function, that every individual has a mind of his own or her own, and they should be encouraged to develop their mind, and certainly they have the right to the political legal right to develop their mind, unlike, let's say, the Taliban in Afghanistan, who will kill a girl for murder her for trying to get the crime of trying to get an education. So you wipe out the thinking of half the human race. Can't get an education. She can't develop her mind. Half the human race now, and that's been the story historically. In many cases, you wonder how many more geniuses there would have been, and how many more advances we would have made if, one, the rights of women to educate and develop their minds were upheld and recognized, and two, more broadly, the right of any human being, male or female, to do it. But the West, more than any other culture, has liberated the mind, and not an accident. Where do you see most of the women who are educated and successful in various careers? Where? Mostly in the West, and in the Asian tigers, where post World War II, Western culture had a very positive influence.
Last question, if I may. How do you see Western civilization today? How well we are doing? What is the health status of Western civilization? Because it seems to me like there is a relentless attack on Western civilization. Europe, there is some kind of even I wouldn't say big replacement, but they are actually changing the population. They are pushing the wrong ideologies. How well do we fare in today's world?
Western civilization things are bad. It's grim right now. Western civilization is not dead, but is it being killed? Is it on life support? It's under such relentless attack from the left, who controls the university humanities programs and the school system. In the United States, they control the Democratic Party, they control Hollywood, they control the media. They have tremendous power cultural power. They hate Western civilization. This is why I support Trump, because even though I see all of his flaws, I think the left is vastly worse.
I
And
heard a lecture by someone who just called him Mango Mussolini. It was funny.
yeah, there's all these objectivists who hate Trump and think he's as bad as the left. I don't agree. He's bad enough.
Yeah.
But the left is much worse. But anyhow, the West, that's a whole other topic. But Western civilization, and the Western civilization is not under attack from Trump and the conservatives, mostly, overwhelmingly from the left, and which is why, I spend most of my polemical time arguing not against the conservatives, but against the leftists. So we need to stand up. Anybody who values reason and freedom, we need to stand up and speak out, not necessarily to defend Trump, or the conservatives, but to stand up for Western, for the commitment to reason, the commitment to freedom, and to speak out. The leftists are wrong. They're Marxists, which is a mistaken philosophy, to put it mildly. They want to push us into a communist dictatorship, which is horrible, to put it mildly. We need to stand up and speak out for reason and freedom. We need to encourage people to get an education, read Aristotle, read the thinkers of the Enlightenment, read the great economists from Adam Smith to Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman, read Ayn Rand, read Atlas Shrugged, read all these books that show that, why, and how reason is man's means of survival and freedom is necessary for the mind to be free. We need to be educated and stand up and speak out on behalf of reason and freedom, and the civilization where those principles were most fully embodied, Western civilization.
If I may, I would like to ask one last question. Do you have the patience for that?
Yeah. It's lunchtime for me. I got to go get some food. But one more question, Harry.
One more question. I can see also an attack on art and beauty, and it seems like the entertainment itself has changed dramatically. It's very decadent in many ways today. Is that also part of the attack on Western civilization?
Yes. Yeah. It's all an integrated whole. So, when you support reason and freedom, you'll believe in heroes. Mm-hmm. The great who are the great heroes? Aristotle's a great hero. John Locke's a great hero. Isaac Newton. The men in Ayn Rand, to me, is a great hero. The men and women of the mind who've made all these advances and learned how to grow crops and learned how to cure diseases and learned how to write a constitution and a Bill of Rights to protect freedoms. And these are the great heroes. And because I wrote a whole book on heroes, Harry, heroes, legends, champions, why heroism matters. Mm-hmm. I've always been a hero worshiper, and I was doing all this research and thinking, and I realized there's two types of heroes. There's the producers, the people I've just been talking about, who are basically intellectuals and make advances in every field imaginable. And then there's the protectors, the military men, the cops, my favorite fictional detective, Sherlock Holmes, the protectors, because they're bad guys in the world. There are Nazis, there are communists, there are jihadists, there were the Mongols, there are all kinds of bad guys. And the great thinkers need protection. And so when you're on the premise that civilization is valuable and human life is important, then you recognize the great heroes, the productive geniuses, and the protectors, and you make movies about them, and you write books about them. And notice in the 20th century, and you were talking about the decadence in the art world, in literature certainly, and in film, and you see the rise of the anti-hero mentality, the idea that the hero worshipers like me, we recognize human beings can be strong, strong in a healthy way, that we create wealth, not that we kill people or we destroy, but we create, not destroy. We make life possible. We stand for life, not for death, in different ways, producing the values that life depends on and protecting the producers. And we have all kinds of stories about great heroes. Well, the anti-hero mentality following World War I is that, no, human beings don't have that kind of moral strength. We're internally, we're morally weak. We're dominated by society or by the family, whatever. And you see the anti-hero mentality in the movies and in novels and in drama. So there's one indication of it. And in the fine arts, when you value human life and civilization, beauty is good. Beauty is a good thing. And you see a lot of beauty in painting and sculpture. Well, if you think human beings are basically, life in the sewer, as Ayn Rand called it, human beings are basically morally weak and no good, then you get ugliness, and paintings and sculpture becomes dedicated to the ugly, not to the beautiful. And by the way, since I'm a big movie guy, beauty is not the most important thing in human life. Character is, but beauty is a good thing. And you notice in the old movies, they really value movie stars were really good looking. That's still true today. A lot of movie stars are still very good looking people, but it's not, it's not. I think this to the same degree. I think a lot of some Brad Pitt. You see, Brad Pitt was like this specimen. Brad Pitt go out of his way to make himself look. I didn't shave him, but make himself go look scruffy and and not as good looking as he as he really is. I don't think you saw the movie stars back in the during Hollywood's golden age. There was beauty was a value. They say when Hedy Lamarr, movie star in the 30s and 40s, when she first she was European, right? She was Austrian, maybe. In fact, one of her parents was Jewish. Was
I'm
I
not
think?
sure.
Yeah, I think so. But anyway, was speaking in Israel, so we praise Judaism whenever we can. But I think, and she was a brilliant inventor, by the way, as well as a movie star. But they say when what's his name, Louis Mayer from MGM. Well, Louis Mayer, billed her as the world's most beautiful woman, and when she first appeared in a movie in American movie theaters, there was like this gasp of how beautiful she was. So beauty's a value. It's not the most important value. Character is, and intellect to develop all of the values that make human life possible. But beauty's a value, and back in the day, it was more recognized when we moved to away from glorifying civilization and everything that goes into it. We moved away, and all the values that make it possible and make life enjoyable, we moved away from this glorification of beauty towards more ugliness. Hollywood movies still have a lot of beautiful people in it. I think not as much as in the past, but the stories don't glorify heroes.
It's more like a propaganda to push forward.
Oh yeah, it's woke.
Agendas.
Yeah, it's woke. Even the superhero movies have become woke.
Yes.
So it's ugly. But we got to stand up. Ayn Rand gave us the intellectual ammunition, so everybody needs to read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, educate themselves, and then stand up for reason, freedom, individual rights.
Absolutely. And they should also listen to you and read your book. So just tell my audience where they can find your work, please.
Oh, thank you for that, Harry. Yeah, my website is andrewbernstein.net. So they can go to andrewbernstein.net. Like here's my book on education. I should have brought a copy of. Hold on one second. Let me get a copy. Okay. Right back.
Thank you.
Keep talking, Harry.
So I would like to remind all of you to get the book translated to Hebrew about Introduction to Capitalism by Andrew Bernstein. It's a very good book. And he wrote a few other books, and I think he's going to show it now.
Harry and everybody, here's my book on heroes, legends, champions, why heroism matters. This, I think, also this is an important book because hero worship is, we're talking about glorifying civilization. Well, we need to glorify the heroes, recognize and glorify the heroes who make civilization possible. So
Mhm.
this, I think, is an important book, and of course, education is the most important field of all, where we need to train the children to think for themselves, not indoctrinate them with propaganda. So, and I think the second half of this book shows exactly how to improve education. But anyhow, my website is andrewbernstein.net. So andrewbernstein.net. So I appreciate you giving me a chance to advertise my books, Harry. Thank you.
Of course, thank you very much. So, with your permission, I will conclude the recording, and I really thank you from the bottom of my heart for your time and insights and knowledge. It's amazing, as usual, with you.
Well, thank you, Harry, and you're welcome. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you very much.
Okay.